Scot Washington is an American historian, writer, and educator. He received his bachelor's degree in liberal arts from Illinois State University and received his master's in liberal arts from Duke University. He has a long history with Eastman Kodak, and most recently as the assistant director of the Orange County History Museum. You can hear him on the radio every week on WCHL 97.9 from 5:30 to 6 p.m. in a segment called History Matters on the Aaron Keck Show. Scot is one of the nation's top experts on the 1788 Constitutional Convention in Hillsborough, North Carolina, which proved pivotal to Americans having a Bill of Rights as we know it today. I think he can add U.S. Constitution enthusiast to his many talents. Please welcome Scot Washington.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you also the Durham Public Library and also the People's Channel, and all of you here tonight. I hope you have your stress balls. I wish they had these in 1788. It might have helped them too. We are going to talk about really exciting history. I think it's exciting, and I think you're going to find it exciting too. And it starts, and I'm going to kind of just first jump into this because I think this is the fastest, easiest way to talk about it. In 1788 now, this is a while back, there was a constitutional convention in Hillsborough from July 21st to August 4th that changed U.S. history and world history. Now, the big question, two questions are, who's been to Hillsborough? Anybody been to Hillsborough? Excellent. Oh, this is much better. How about, anybody heard about the 1788 convention? Okay, well, there's one. Good. The history teacher has heard of it. That's good. This is one of those things that I stumbled into as a corporate refugee from Eastman Kodak, and it was at that time in the late 2000s when everybody was doing all different things. And I looked around, and here was this position at the the Orange County Historical Museum for an assistant director. And I went, well, that certainly is in my, the kind of things that I like to do. So I went over there, applied, and then found out when I started working there that I had stumbled in to the Disneyland of history. And in fact, where the museum is located in downtown Hillsborough is right on the site where this pivotal constitutional convention took place. So I was immediately interested and said, okay, what's going on and why Hillsborough? Why do we even need a convention? What's the big deal? And was there a big deal? So I started researching this, and I found some amazing things about it. Now, of course, we all know if you're here tonight, you're interested in the Constitution, and I'll do the obligatory. How many people have actually read it or looked at it anytime soon? Oh, this is great. Excellent. I like to see that. It's a wonderful document. It's not just laws, but it actually has some literary value. So it's appropriate that the Durham County Public Library would be sponsoring something about the U.S. Constitution as part of its every 2 or 3 years when they do a Durham Reads Together across all ages in a community. And this is a good one because it wasn't written by lawyers. It was written by ordinary people that were trying to say something important. And those words still resonate today. Well, here's a good question about why Hillsborough. And I think a good way to look at Hillsborough is to imagine a place in the center of the state where there is nothing else. Hillsborough, back in 1788, was the Las Vegas of North Carolina. It had a racetrack. It had taverns. This is where you had to pay your taxes. You had to come in, but there was no Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill. So you're saying, why didn't they have it there? Well, those places didn't exist yet, but Hillsborough did. And Hillsborough's history stretched back all the way back to 1754 when the town was founded to serve this large county that existed because settlers were coming into the area. And it was a planned town. In fact, we have a map of 1768 in Hillsborough done by Claude Saudier, a French cartographer. And the streets in the historic district are in the same place with the same street names as 1768. Now that's kind of wild. There's King Street, if you've ever been there, you know there's the old courthouse and the Colonial Inn. King Street was named after King George III in his lifetime, which is kind of a wild thing to think about. Tryon Street was named after Governor William Tryon, one of the last English colonial governors. And this makes Hillsborough a kind of a unique kind of microcosm. At this convention, one of the things they did was to determine where the capital was. Hillsborough was in the running, but there were other communities that said, no, there's too many vested interests. And finally, it was I think maybe a tavern owner in Wake County that said, I've got some wide open space here. And so Raleigh becomes a planned capital city, but it bypasses Hillsborough, and consequently Hillsborough has the distinction of being a place like colonial Williamsburg. Without the distance, the cost, or the travel, you can actually go down to a place. The streets are in the same place, they're slightly wider. We've gone from horses to horsepower. But that's the place in 1788 where this Constitutional Convention takes place. And the reason it takes place is because of what happens preceding that. Now, during the Revolutionary War, we kind of cast our minds back to this. You had this loose voluntary alliance of states. They operated under something called the Articles of Confederation. Now, it worked pretty well because these states were pretty independent. But after the war, some of the problems began to surface. They couldn't raise money. They couldn't have a standing army. And there were still superpowers out there, France, England, Spain, and the nation's leaders began to really worry. You couldn't even make treaties because since this was a voluntary alliance, states could opt out. And that's what happened in some instances. So it prompted the nation's leaders to say, we need something different, just for safety's sake. And in 1787, they were given a charge to revise the Articles of Confederation. But there's only one thing, that it wasn't going to be easy. So George Washington did something amazing. He had everyone come in, these delegates from these different states, no press, close the doors, and we're going to hash this out. And what emerged several months later, September 17th, 1787, is what we know as the original Constitution, this remarkable document that is kind of preserved. And the next step was, okay, it needed to be ratified. Now, the people doing this realized that they might not get unanimous consent. So they hedged their bets. They said, if we get 9 out of 13, that's enough. We're going to go ahead. But nobody really thought through, well, what happens if people actually reject this? So it began this process of going to states. Rhode Island, a little pesky little state that had been the thorn in everybody's side by always saying no, actually didn't even hold a convention like they were supposed to. They just put it to the voters, and 10-1, the voters without any debate said no. But everybody else started doing the right process, having a convention. And when they did, it was about half ratified it as is, and half ratified it but suggested amendments. And here's the key. The Constitution that went out was what I call the vanilla version of the Constitution. There was only the kind of sections for legislative, judicial, and executive, but nothing else. No Bill of Rights as we know it today. So it goes through, and North Carolina back in January of 1788 begins the process. They elect delegates from across the state. And North Carolina is a kind of a big deal. It's the 4th largest state in population. It stretches from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, encompassing what is all of today Tennessee. And so these delegates gather. There are about 300 delegates. They're second largest as a convention, only to Massachusetts in size. But early on, the governor, who is a proponent of let's go ahead and ratify it, realizes, as does his allies, that they are outnumbered in the people who get elected. And the people who got elected, there was what we call the Federalists, the people who said, let's go ahead, anything is better than what we have, let's move ahead. And then there were what were termed the anti-Federalists, let's call them the skeptics, the people who said, yeah, but maybe it's not good enough. Well, those skeptics outnumbered the Federalists by over 2-1. And the Federalists knew it. So they're going into this convention on an uphill battle to try to convince other people that they needed to do something different. And that's where things come in 1788, and it's July 21st, and I think they thought, well, let's see what's going to happen. As it turns out, about half ratified it, other states, and half ratified it with amendments. In fact, they had 10 states by that point. They only needed 9. So the Constitution was going to go into effect. All really North Carolina needed to do was to rubber stamp it and move on. But that doesn't happen. And instead, we have a vigorous debate. It almost doesn't start that way. It starts on July 21st, 1788, 10 years to the day when delegates from North Carolina signed the Articles of Confederation. Now, it's held in Hillsborough because this is a central place. The building they actually could meet in was big enough. Actually, it looks a little bit larger than the drawings that have been associated with it because there was at least 300 delegates. There were another, probably 200 other people there as well, including other people in the upper galleries. And wisely, the Federalists hired someone with a pen to take notes, and that person did, and we know it because he actually concluded this long segment, or he's taking shorthand, ink-stained hands, and he's taking down notes about what people are saying, and he says finally at the end, it's been rather noisy up here. I didn't get all the speeches. And he'll say in there, well, Governor Johnson was speaking in a low voice. I don't know what he said. But it's as close as we're ever going to get to being a fly on the wall, to finding out just exactly what was happening here in North Carolina and the debate that was going on. Now, Hillsborough is a place that has a lot of history. And it doesn't just start in the 1780s. It doesn't just start in the 1770s during the Revolutionary War or the regulator season when the town was founded. It goes back much further. The Occaneechi Indians were there hundreds of years before. There's actually some evidence that there was nomadic Indian tribes called the Clovis Tribes that were coming in, that were in the Americas 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. And how do we know this? Well, firsthand. I got a call one day from Tim Duffy of Music Makers, and he said, I was digging around in my garden, and I found a strange kind of an arrowhead. I don't know what this is. I said, okay, well, just send me a picture. We know we've had a lot of Native Americans. He sent me this picture, and my eyes bulged out, and I went, where did you find this? He said, in my garden. I said, okay, hold on to this, because this is a Clovis spear point. These are the people who were in the Americas 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, proving that they were here in Hillsborough. Hillsborough also has a 500 million-year-old mountain, Occaneechi Mountain. If you've ever been up there, it's a gorgeous view over the overlook. Takes about 10 minutes. But it's proof that we've had people in this area for many years. And indeed, the people who study our roads and how they end up being roads will tell you that there is the Indian trading paths that came through this area, and that's how settlers came into this area. And when the British chose Hillsborough, they knew what they were doing, and they laid it out north, south, east, and west. But it's a place that has been rich in history for a very, very long time. There's another thing about Hillsborough that kind of makes it unique, and that's a place that has part of its darker history. In the 1760s, this is when we have a large amount of dissension that occurs, especially in this part of the state, over the issues of fairness. Fairness in government, fairness in monies being collected. It's known as the regulators. That's because that term, as best we can tell, occurs when people were coming to pay their taxes and they were having to pay large amounts of fees, not associated with the taxes, but simply because this was going into the pockets of the people who were paying the taxes. The entrepreneurial system the British developed worked pretty well in other areas, but especially here, it was a hand behind the back. And what they did was to basically say, all right, if you're appointed to a position in authority in a county, you may not draw a salary, but you were allowed to charge fees for your services. And the fee schedule was so convoluted and complex that it led to all kinds of arbitrary interpretations. And so people might come in to pay their taxes and it would be so much, but the fees associated with the taxes would be a lot more. Oh, I've got to pick up my pen. Well, there's a shilling. Oh, I've got to dip it in ink. Oh, yes, well, that's another shilling. People started to raise questions. Even Governor Tryon, an English colonial governor, could not account for over 50% of the money collected not going into the public coffers. But he wasn't going to upset the apple cart, because if you're appointed by the governor to a lucrative position, who do you make sure that you reward with the gratitude? And it would be the governor. So this was a kind of a system that was not going to benefit a lot of people. People raised reasonable questions, and then something happens. Governor Tryon was an English colonial officer in the French Indian War that began in 1754. The Canadians will call this the 7-Year War, but if you were to look at a map of America, it looked very much like Canada does today. The East Coast was English, the middle of the country was French, and then you had Spanish down in Florida. And settlers kept pushing to the west, English settlers. There were several million versus about 60,000 in the middle of the country. And the Native American tribes had alliances with the French. And finally, an English officer, English trained officer, is sent in to try to negotiate. Those negotiations break down, a battle ensues, and it begins this 7-Year War. That British trained officer was George Washington. Now, another of the officers involved in this was Governor Tryon. So you have these interesting people on different ends of the spectrum. And then this 7-Year War ends, comes to the close, and guess what? The English win. They get the middle part of the country. They get into Canada on the eastern seaboard. The French get up into the middle part of Canada. And so it all looks well, except there's 10,000 British troops here. There are 1,500 officers. And guess what? Great Britain does not want them back. So they say, well, what are we going to do? We don't want to pay them. We don't want them back here. Oh, I know. The colonies, yes, they should be paying for their protection. And so a dim-witted scheme is, let's charge them, let's tax them. And they put a tax on paper called the Stamp Act. The only thing is they forgot to talk with the British colonists who are here, and that, of course, are the folks here in the Americas, who immediately raised the cry, no taxation without representation. Have you heard this before? Well, that's what happens. And of course, Britain takes about 6 weeks one way to sail over to get to it, about 6 weeks back, and if you're there for a couple weeks, you know, you're talking about a 3 or 4 month round trip. And Britain is resistant to this, but there are protests all across the counties and colonies because this seems unfair. And in fact, in Wilmington, the person who was assigned to be the tax collector for the Stamp Act arrives, people know about it, and they persuade him to resign, and then they throw a big parade. And that pretty well does it for North Carolina. That's across all the colonies. It's such a fiasco that Britain finally repeals the act, but they never repeal their mindset to involve these colonists on this side of the pond in those decision makings and keep coming back with tax after tax. And again, there's this kind of rub. Of course, there's also 10,000 British troops here and 1,500 officers. And that begins to create its own problems as well. So I'm telling you all this because of what happens in 1770. Again, the pushback on fairness and of paying fees. People have stopped paying taxes. It's a widespread movement. And they get the name the regulators as best we can tell, because when they asked, why are we paying these fees and taxes, they would be told, well, it's in the the regulations. And they said, well, we're the regulators, and we're telling you we're not going to pay this. And I don't think any of us, I think we would all be raising questions about this as well. Alamance County in 1771, May 19th, Governor Tryon goes out to meet these protesters. He's had it. He's also armed with what's called a Johnson Riot Act, which gives him unlimited ability to really take aggressive action. People cannot assemble. They're supposed to pay fees and taxes. And at Alamance County, and anybody been here, been there, or sometime you might want to go there. It's really interesting because it is so seminal. And Governor Tryon, with 1,100 militia and cannon, lines up at point-blank range. And these militia, I talked with a musket expert, could shoot about 4 rounds a minute. The average farmer could shoot about 1 round a minute. And not all of them were armed. About 2,000 folks, they're all mustering there. And they think, well, it's great. The governor's coming out, and he's, show of force. Isn't that nice? And the governor is not playing around. And 2 negotiators turn to leave. The governor says, you're my prisoner. And one, Robert Thompson, says, no way. He starts to go, and the accounts are mixed, but the governor either shoots him or orders him shot. Other people see this, and they're kind of stunned. Shots ring out. That's all the provocation the governor needs. Fire or fire on me, the governor orders. They are fired. The cannons fire, the muskets fire, a battle ensues. And shocking as it may seem, just to kind of give you context, a year before, Boston Massacre, 5 people die. Crispus Attucks, first African-American, dies in the Revolutionary War. Great outrage. Now, here we are a year later. It's May 19th. And 2 days after the battle, Governor Tryon is writing in correspondence that he never expects to get public to a General Waddell that he estimates 200 to 300 were killed. Now, this is absolutely shocking. And that number is repeated in the Virginia Gazette within the month, which is just still a shocking number. The governor always reports his figures. 9 of his militiamen die, 61 wounded. And that stays standard, but he never reports in any official correspondence that I've ever seen what the other numbers were, because that would have been shocking. I wish I could say that this is too unbelievable, except that Governor Tryon, when he goes to be governor of New York, does pretty much the same thing. After that battle, he takes prisoners. Amazingly enough, there's no accounts of wounded being taken, but 15 prisoners are. The day after the battle, one man, James Few, is hanged without benefit of a trial, and then 14 men are dragged around while the governor engages in a real campaign of terror. He goes to anybody who's a farm, has a farm that has signed these petitions, takes everything of value, burns it to the ground. People immediately begin to say, how can we avoid this? And his answer is simple: pay your fees and taxes, disarm, swear allegiance. Well, a number flee to the west, and those who do have to do that. The governor brings these poor folks into Hillsborough in June of 1771, puts them on trial for high treason. 14 men, 2 call witnesses, as was their right, and they're acquitted because there's no real evidence that they were guilty of anything. But the governor puts a halt to that. There will be no more witnesses. 12 men are sentenced to death in Hillsborough. And at this point, the militia is starting to get a little uneasy. So the governor magnanimously says, well, we'll set aside 6 of these sentences pending the king's favor. They all later go free. But 6 of them are executed in Hillsborough. And that spot still remains. There is a marble slab that was either placed shortly thereafter. It's one of those places that's only 2 blocks away from where this convention site is. These people weren't guilty of much more than exercising freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, and they were denied due process and legal fairness. This is part of the discussion that goes on for the people coming into Hillsborough that are very aware of this history. These people that gathered together as delegates fought together in the Revolutionary War. They've been through provincial congresses that were held in not only Hillsborough but across the state. They know each other and they know the history well for 20 years. And so when they gather together, this is part of the discussion that's going on, is what about this new Constitution? The state had a Constitution, the original one, that had a Declaration of Rights and also had information about how to run the state. But that was very important. And when the convention opens up, after they do some of their first kind of business to kind of get settled for, here's how we're going to address each other, here's what we're going to do. The second day, somebody makes a motion, let's read the Articles of Confederation, let's read the state's constitution, let's read the Declaration of Rights. They do, because this puts it in play about what we're looking at, which is this new U.S. Constitution, which has a glaring defect. There is no Bill of Rights. And that becomes readily apparent. The third day, in fact, Wiley Jones gets up and makes a motion, you know, I'm ready to vote now. I don't even need a discussion. We've all pretty much, they had already been looking at this Constitution for months, and people were pretty much decided, we're good. And at this point, there was immediate pushback. No, wait a minute. We need to at least go through it article by article. Every other state has had a discussion. We should at least be able to do that too. And so they save the day, James Iredell does, by appealing to people, let's get through this, and they do. So what happened? What changed history? Well, this is the neat thing, is the discussions that occur as they go through the Constitution become absolutely vital. And I'm going to share a couple of these dialogues, only because they're so interesting. And I'm going to talk about one that comes up fairly early, and it's in the first section, the first clause of the 9th section. And it talks about, well, you'll know it when I read it, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the estates now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. Now, this is about slavery. This is about one of the most inhumane practices ever known to humankind. And the reason why you don't hear that word, because it was so odious to the majority of the states, they wouldn't even allow the word in there. The two states that were the holdout were Georgia and South Carolina, who said, well, you're not going to get us signing on to this Constitution unless we have some of these provisions. And so there was a sense of, well, 20 years, all right, well, then we'll have ended it and it will be done. And in fact, to those people who say, oh, everybody was for this, I challenge that. And here's Mr. Iredell, James Iredell, and this is what he says. Mr. Chairman, I rise to express sentiments similar to those of the gentleman from Craven. For my part, were it practicable to put an end to the importation of slaves immediately, it would give me the greatest pleasure. For it certainly is a trade utterly inconsistent with the rights of humanity, and under which great cruelties have been exercised. When the entire abolition of slavery takes place, it will be an event which must be pleasing to every generous mind and every friend of human nature. It was the wish of the great majority of the convention to put an end to the trade immediately, but the states of South Carolina and Georgia would not agree to it. I heartily wish more could have been done. I hope, therefore, that this part of the Constitution will not be condemned because it is not stipulated for what was impracticable to obtain. And at this point, Mr. Galloway says, Mr. Chairman, the explanation given to this clause does not satisfy my mind. I wish to see this abominable trade put an end to. And that's what many people thought. And in fact, Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, led the Congress in passing the law that says, oh, okay, we're not going to do this. But they just didn't go further and say, this is wrong. This is fundamentally morally wrong, and they should have. All right, what happens on July 28th is the meat of the matter that really solidifies people's views on the Constitution and what is missing here. And that is the section on the judiciary, which gives all of the vested power in determining the laws to the Supreme Court. And at this point, thank goodness, Mr. Spencer gets up and he says these wonderful prophetic words. I mean, they ring out over 200 years later, and I think you'll agree. He says, Mr. Chairman, I have objections to this article. Our rights are not guarded. There is no Declaration of Rights to secure to every member of the society those unalienable rights which ought not to be given up to any government. Such a Bill of Rights would be a check upon men in power. I know it is said that what is not given up to the United States will be retained by the individual states. I know it ought to be so and should be so understood, but, sir, it is not declared to be so. There ought to be a Bill of Rights, in order that those in power may not step over the boundary between the powers of government and the rights of people, which they may do when there is nothing to prevent them. They may do so without a Bill of Rights. Notice will not be readily taken of the encroachments of rulers, and they may go a great length before the people are alarmed. Oppressions may therefore take place by degrees, but if there were express terms and bounds laid down, when these were passed by, the people would take notice of them, and oppressions would not be carried on such a length. I look upon it, therefore, that there ought to be something to confine the power of this government within its proper boundaries. Now, at this point, Mr. Iredell jumps to his feet, and he has this to say. He said, because his concern is getting this thing passed, and we'll deal with the Bill of Rights later. He says, Mr. Chairman, I have waited a considerable time in hopes that some other gentleman would fully discuss this point. A Bill of Rights, as I conceive, would not only be incongruous, but dangerous. No man, let his ingenuity be what it will, could emulate all the individual rights not relinquished by this Constitution. Suppose, therefore, an enumeration of a great many, but omission of some. I think, for the reasons I've given, a Bill of Rights is not only unnecessary, but would be absurd and dangerous. Now, Mr. Spencer comes back the next day, the 29th, and says, I still think my observations are well-founded and that some amendments are necessary. The expression, we the people of the United States, shows that this government is intended for individuals. There ought, therefore, to be a Bill of Rights. When individuals enter into society, they give up some rights to secure the rest. There are certain human rights that ought not to be given up and which ought in some manner to be secured. With respect to these great essential rights, no latitude ought to be left. They are the most inestimable gifts of the great Creator and therefore ought not to be destroyed but ought to be secured. They ought to be secured to individuals in consideration of the other rights which they give up to support society. This is the big point. This is the sticking point that's glaringly obvious. It's a Constitution without a Bill of Rights. And without a Bill of Rights, there are people here, you call them anti-federalists, but I think the rest of us would be skeptical too, go, no, it's not good enough. And by August 29th and August 30th and August 31st, that's when Wiley Jones revisits his original motion and said, I'm ready to vote on this. And immediately, Mr. Iredell and Mr. Johnson, they're trying to delay, no. And so Mr. Iredell says, I think I have something that I'd like to propose. And they said, no, we don't want to hear from you. You're part of this minority that wants to push this thing through. This is where we want to vote on this. But Mr. Jones, Wiley Jones, has a proposal. And here's what his proposal is. Resolved, that a Declaration of Rights asserting and securing from encroachment the great principles of civil and religious liberty and the unalienable rights of the people, together with the amendments to the most ambiguous and exceptional parts of the said Constitution of Government, ought to be laid before Congress and the Convention of States that shall or may be called for the purpose of amending the said Constitution for their consideration previous to the ratification of the Constitution aforesaid on the part of the state of North Carolina, followed by 26 amendments, many of them duplicates of what Virginia had suggested after they had ratified it. Well, at this point, and this is kind of the parliamentary procedure that jumps up, Mr. Iredell says, well, we want to be on the record. So if you'll hold off on that for a moment, we want to submit ours. We know we may not get a vote, but we want the record to show. So he says, I would like to strike, and they finally agree. So he says, well, I'd like to strike everything except for the words resolve that, which you can imagine really ticked people off. And then he says, let's basically ratify the Constitution. And oh, by the way, here are 5 kind of suggestions. And then a vote comes up. Let's vote on this. And immediately it's voted down 184 to 84. But they don't go back to the original motion that Wiley Jones had made. They immediately, Governor Johnson said, let's talk about where we're going to fix the Capitol. And that's what they talk about next. And they said, we'll get together at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning to take this up again. So at 6 o'clock, hungover and tired, after a long 2 weeks, they come together and they read again this amendment, and immediately people said, yeah, that's fine, good, I'll vote for it. Well, what did they actually vote for? And this is the interesting thing, because there was another recommendation immediately after that Wiley Jones conveniently had in his pocket that said, oh, by the way, if the rest of the states are collecting fees, then we're going to do it as well, and we're going to forward that on, thinking this will be good. And so the motion that comes up, thinking that did North Carolina neither ratify it or reject it, or what happened? But actually the language is a little more nuanced. It says very clearly that until and when there are amendments offered that address these issues, then North Carolina will join the Union. That's different from rejecting it. It allows it to squeak in, but it does leave a certain problem because there's all kind of confusion. Well, did North Carolina reject it? Did they approve it? Well, they actually voted a little bit differently. They voted to postpone ratifying the Constitution until provisions were made for introducing a Bill of Rights to Congress and the ratifying states. So when Congress meets, because they had already had 9 states, they had 10, and in fact, an 11th, New York ratifies it while they're meeting. The only 2 holdouts are Rhode Island and North Carolina. So Congress is meeting under the new Constitution in March of 1789, and they elect George Washington as president. Well, they've got a constitutional crisis right away. One of the states is not in the Union, or at least 2 of them, North Carolina and Rhode Island. And it's hard to talk about the United States. That's a much better phrase than, well, most of the states. I think we would agree. So within 3 months, you have James Madison coming before Congress and making the impassioned case that there needs to be amendments. In fact, he proposes 20 of them, and he says, we need to put them here and here and there. And thank goodness it is actually the good fellow from Connecticut who says, no, we're not going to have it all over the place. We're not going to red mark this up. We're going to leave that alone. We're actually going to add amendments after the Constitution, even if it affects the original Constitution. And that's what they do. So astonishingly, and we only have the record for the House of Representatives because the Senate was secret at this point, and James Madison was thankfully in the House, but they craft these amendments. 12 of them are passed on September 25th, 1789, and they're sent out to the states for ratification. Now, this is totally new, never been tried before. Only then now does the state have the wherewithal here in North Carolina to finally say, okay, our concerns are ratified. The amendment that we passed at that Constitutional Convention does not say that a Bill of Rights has to be passed. It just said it had to be presented. Well, it's being presented. So they hold another Constitutional Convention, November 21st, 1789, in Fayetteville. This time, the Constitution is ratified, and a month later, North Carolina becomes the 3rd state to ratify the amendments. And they make their way around until in 1791, December 15th, when Virginia ratifies the amendments. 10 of 12, which have gotten enough votes at that point, become the ones we call the Bill of Rights and set in motion this amazing process. Now, if it was just that alone, it would be pretty much incredible. But if you look from the hindsight of history, then it becomes even more remarkable. We know that less than 20 years later, the British come back for Revolutionary War Part II. That's the War of 1812. They burned down the White House, and it ends in 1815. There's a seminal battle in New Orleans that really didn't need to take place, but it's kind of the exclamation point on Americans are here to stay. And it always makes me wonder, if we weren't unified as a country as to basic values, whether we would have survived through that decade, whether we would have survived the British, or whether we'd be talking with a British accent today. And of course, the great thing that Congress did when they sent out these amendments is they made a note. They said, any of these amendments have the same force as the original Constitution. And that is so important, because in these days you will hear sometimes people say, oh yeah, the Constitution, let's go back to the original Constitution as it was written. And I'm going, well, how Amish do you want to get? Because the Constitution includes the amendments. And where would we be without the 13th Amendment that banned slavery, or the 14th that said anyone that's born in the United States is a U.S. citizen, or the 15th that says that your right to vote is not denied by color of your skin? Or where would we be without the 20th Amendment that guaranteed women the right to vote? I mean, the Constitution is something that is gripping. It is not just some ancient law or ancient history, it's our history today. It makes a tremendous difference. And what I always tell people is, if you want to have fun, you know, a good parlor game, get people over, take the first 10 amendments and try to write them the way they were written, as concisely, almost like poetry, to express the thoughts they did. The 9th and 10th provide enough room to say, you know, the right's not explicitly laid out, reserved to the people in the state, but that First Amendment is glorious, and so many of the other ones are as well. So and one of the things that came out of this for me, when I realized the importance that North Carolina provided, that tipping point for history that provided the impetus for Congress taking up this issue that otherwise would not be there, then I said, well, we've got to do something about this. And so I started a tradition that I'm hoping will spread from Hillsborough to Honolulu across 5 time zones. We ring bells. You know, one of the things I said, wow, you know, Bill of Rights Day, December 15th. Boy, why have I never heard of this? And it's true. 1941 is about the first time this happens. Congress realizes it's the 150th anniversary of when the Bill of Rights went into effect. And so they say to President Roosevelt, would you please issue a presidential proclamation? Let's do something. So right after Thanksgiving, absolutely, Roosevelt issues a proclamation. Well, of course, what happens December 7th, 1941? Pearl Harbor. Traditions are muted, but they continue. And every president since then has celebrated Bill of Rights Day by presidential proclamation. And actually, at least once during their term, and starting with Gerald Ford every single year, to celebrate this. But nobody's really thought about how to do it. I mean, you know, on the East Coast, fireworks are dangerous. No, that will start fires. People are busy. There's holiday shopping. There's people out of school. Nobody has time. So I was wondering about this, and then I looked around Hillsborough, and it has 5 wonderful historic churches, some going back as far as the 18th century, like Dickerson Chapel. Underneath the brick veneer of that AME church is the 1790 courthouse that forms the skeleton of that building. And they have these wonderful bells, and I said, they're all different denominations, so I called up the pastors, and I said, would you mind ringing your bells on Bill of Rights Day for as many seconds as the Bill of Rights has been in effect? And so we advertise this, and so what we have done for the last 5 years is right at the stroke of noontime, we start ringing bells in Hillsborough. There's no speeches, there's no posturing. Suddenly bells start ringing. You start hearing these lovely bells from St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, the Hillsborough Presbyterian Church, Hillsborough United Methodist Church, First Baptist, Dickerson Chapel AME, and anybody at the historic sites like the Regulator site or in front of the old courthouse or anywhere on the streets. People bang pots. It's wonderful. And for, I'll tell you, 225 seconds like we did a few years ago, that's a long time to ring bells. Suddenly you have an idea of like, wow, this thing has been in existence a very long time. And the first year we did it, a car pulled up with tinted windows. And I went, uh-oh, should I be calling someone? And right at noontime, the window went down, a hand went out with a little bell and started ringing. And at the end of the allotted time, the hand went back in, the window went up, and off whoever drove. And I said, my first drive-by ringing. This is great. And my hope is that someday we can do this all across America, across all 5 time zones, and anywhere in the world where people are in agreement with these great values. And wouldn't it be nice if the most terrible sound that would make any tyrant tremble anywhere in the world was not the sound of gunfire, but the sound of tinkling bells? And that's what the Convention of 1788 made possible. It's your birthright. I invite you to go over to Hillsborough anytime, especially around December 15th, and ring bells too. Thank you very much.
If anyone has questions for Scott, he's taking questions. Questions end with a question mark, someone told me. So if you have one, I have a feeling he could answer a lot of questions about history, not just North Carolina, but especially North Carolina and Hillsborough.
If you have answers, I'll supply questions.
And I forgot to say one short thing, which is that this program is part of the Durham Reads Together, the U.S. Constitution 2017. That is the assignment. We're all going to read it, right? I'll start up at the back with that question.
I would also say, Jenny, that the Durham County Library has been very generous to fund these free copies of the U.S. Constitution. So you can pick one up, and as you can see, it's in my back pocket. It's fun reading. It really is. I hope you'll find it fun, too.
Sir, you had a question?
What happened to Rhode Island? Are they part of the Union now?
Yeah. Yes, the end of May 1790, they finally were persuaded, like, well, you better kind of have, they had a convention and finally squeaked by, and yes, they are now officially part of the Union. But it's always a fun trivia question to say about the Bill of Rights, like, how long did the country not have Bill of Rights protecting it? And basically, for a couple of years, actually the Constitution goes out, the amendments are approved, they're sent out in 1789, but it's not till 1791. Now, most of the states had Declaration of Rights, so they were protected, but that's a kind of a fun thing to know. Like, it wasn't always the case, but when it did, it protects us and protects anyone who comes to this country as well. Any other questions? Yes?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. That was great. I have friends coming in from Oregon I haven't seen in 20 years, and I'll definitely take them up to Hillsborough on Saturday and tell them about December 15th and spread the word.
Good. Well, there's the museum, the Orange County Historical Museum, Visitor Center. You can actually go to the Regulator Historic Site, the Burwell site where Elizabeth Keckley was. So many good things over there.
I have a question. I appreciate my students. I teach American history at Durham Tech, and I've been telling them that the Alexander Hamilton decided didn't want states ratifying the Constitution, and that I think he had a feud with the governor of New York at the time, and he insisted that there would be constitutional conventions of people elected or appointed. Did this occur both at the ratification of the Constitution and the amendments, and it was not the state legislatures that ratified?
That's correct. People were elected specifically for these conventions as delegates, and that's why when Rhode Island put the vote to the populace, it wasn't the way, and it didn't count, basically, because they had to hold a convention with elected delegates. Yeah, good point. Yes?
You said that there were basic values, and I always consider family values that I hear people talk about, but they never talk about what happened to the indigenous people. Mm-hmm. Slavery was horrible, and its vestiges still are.
Yes.
Why is it the Native Americans are never talked about when these settlers were moving into Hillsborough? Weren't there people living here at that point?
That's right.
And
now,
they
it was
wiped out.
Well, they actually, I'm not sure they were wiped out because the Occaneechi folks are still there. They used to do their powwows certainly in Hillsborough. They're rebuilding one of the older structures downtown. But they blended with and married into different communities. So you will find a rich heritage of people, which I think across the board you would find this happening. That makes an issue not one of like we're going to conquer and kill. That didn't happen. And that makes Hillsborough a little different because there is that kind of dialogue that goes on. But yeah, it's a very good point, and it's very much a part to say, hey, that's why the Constitution is unique. It applies to people. And why Guantanamo, there it is in enemy combatants, but they won't bring them here because if they did, all of our laws of our Constitution, provided for in the Constitution, applies to anyone. So it's not just people who are citizens, but anyone who's here. And that's why there's resistance to bring those combatants into the United States, because if they come into a state, they will then fall under the jurisdiction of these rights. And there are people who don't want that to happen. Yeah.
I grew up in Alabama 87 years ago.
Wow.
And I have experienced so much. I guess humbly I could say I have a good European education, but I wrestle with a reconciliation between the reality of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments when I have to also acknowledge the reality of gerrymandering and voter suppression, poor quality of education, and many other things that hold my people back in spite of the fact that I have Googled 18 pages of contributions that my people have made in the areas of science and medicine and inventions which translated into the wealth of this country. What do you have to say about that?
Oh, I concur completely. And I think that's a challenge that we have. I don't think the Constitution is the end all because obviously it requires us to uphold these values and to uphold the idea of a society that we want. And as the opening words of the preamble say, towards a more perfect union. Well, we're not there yet. And we need to be continuing to work. And I really appreciate what you had to say. And your life is a testimony to hope persevering in hard times. Because you think of the last, it is. I mean, when you think of these last 87 years, we had Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, the Civil Rights. It takes all these voting acts to bring basic dignity to people's lives, and somehow that seems wrong. And if there's anything that happened with Charlottesville, is that we saw people standing up to hate speech and saying no. And I think that's a testimony to people's basic DNA saying, kicking in as Americans and saying, we can recognize good and we can recognize evil, and there are values that we hold that are part of who we are and that are part of our larger heritage. And that gave me hope, was people standing up and saying no. And maybe that's what we need more of in our times. But thank you for that. Thank you for a witness of your life. You've made my night, and I appreciate it. Yeah.
I'm going to apologize for throwing this hand grenade at you.
Good.
Of course, you mentioned Charlottesville, and then, of course, was it a week ago Sunday, we had this horrible incident in Las Vegas, and lo and behold, here we are debating the Second Amendment about the right the people to keep in their arms shall not be abridged, if I'm quoting the Second Amendment correctly. I've gone on Facebook for my own page, and I do support gun control because, number one, we are not facing the British Army or the Navy.
No.
And number two, the Native Americans are not trying to scalp every settler that's now on the frontier. So the question, the hand grenade is, do you personally think that it's time perhaps that the Second Amendment and some other amendments may need to be revisited?
Well, I think James Iredell thought that the fifth article of the Constitution, was allowed amending it, was the best. He said that this is something that was missing from many other forms of government. This one he thought was tremendous. The Second Amendment, though, we never read the first part of it, which is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. You know, back in the day when this amendment was formulated, and you had people like English colonial governor Tryon, who's trying to disarm people, you had the militia. There was no standing army. You had a militia was basically everyone was part of the National Guard because you had a weapon to protect your family. But it was a musket that fired 1 round a minute. Now, that's very different than an automatic weapon that fires hundreds of rounds a minute. And I think we would probably all agree with that. Do we need to revisit these things? We certainly do. We certainly need to say, where is this coming from? And do we need bazookas? I mean, what's the limit to this, the right to bear arms? And it should allow us to have a healthy discussion about not only the context in which that was formulated, but also these very, very serious occasions, whether it's Las Vegas or elsewhere, where we have seen repeated instances of people being harmed. And ask, if there are other places in the world, are they doing something that we're not? And certainly it seems that we can revisit that anytime. And of course we can amend amendments. Of course we can. Sure. Any other questions? Yeah.
Since the Constitutional Convention in Fayetteville was successful, would you mind elaborating on that just a little bit?
Sure. Well, this was a great relief, but when those amendments were passed, and again, North Carolina became that tipping point for these actually coming up, because when you read the congressional record, people are saying we've got to do so many things to establish government, we don't have time. And James Mattis is insistent, saying we need to do this. Finally, they get on board, they produce the amendments, they go out, and only then does North Carolina said, okay, the original resolution that passed in 1788 from that Constitutional Convention was dependent on the amendments, a Bill of Rights being presented to Congress and the ratifying states. It didn't say they had to pass. So when that consideration was taken into effect, it allowed the Federalists to make the case like, hey, you folks voted for this thing, and now we've got a Bill of Rights that's presented. And that's why in Fayetteville, they went ahead and ratified it, and then a month later, the amendments. And those go out. So the implications was that now North Carolina could actually join Congress. They could actually hold elections and be represented in Congress. Before then, they had the equivalent of an ambassador, Hugh Williamson, who had also signed the Constitution, was up in New York, and that's where Congress was. There was no Washington, D.C. at this point. It was New York. And he's in New York basically alleviating the concerns and fears that North Carolina is going off and doing their own thing. And he's saying, no, 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 no. Wait and wait, because we want to be a part of this. We're collecting money for the fees and taxes, so we want to be a part of this, but we need to have this condition met. So it's a very good question. At that point, there was a big sigh of relief by many people because now North Carolina could be a part of this. They could elect senators and representatives and become a formative voice in the shaping of the country, which they have ever since. Another fun fact is that there were a couple of states that, because they only needed 3/4 of them to ratify the convention, the amendments, that did not ratify them, including Massachusetts. And so in 1939, somebody said, yeah, do you guys want to ratify these amendments now? And they went, oh, gosh, yeah, well, we'll go ahead and ratify that now. So those are the nice moments of history. But to know that these still have an impact and they've been quietly protecting us to say outrageous things, to say whatever's on our hearts and minds. And I can't think of a better place than here at the Durham Arts Council. If you go downstairs and you see an art gallery full of self-expression of any kind and shape on any subject, and there's no censor coming around, you can thank that First Amendment. The fact that we're even in here discussing that is another testimony, and the fact that you can go to the Durham County Public Library any day of the week and look up information, and there is protection of your records and what you're looking for is a real testimony to what these amendments are all about.
Scott, thanks so much for your program. So if we were late to the party on the Constitution and third on the Bill of Rights, why do our license plates say first and freedom?
Well, I honestly,
baloney?
no. Well, you'd have to talk about Ohio. Ohio has some other questions about and challenges to that. But I have said that I think that North Carolina can honestly claim the moniker birthplace of the Bill of Rights. Not because they came up with these necessarily, but because they provided the impetus that made Congress address these issues and actually provided the fuel for them being addressed. And I think that would be a fair claim to say we're the birthplace of the Bill of Rights, thanks to what happened in Hillsborough in 1788. Does everybody else agree with that? Does that sound like a good thing? Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice to see on our license plate? Yeah.
I wish I had a question, but I feel like I've learned everything. It's all clear now. And I wanted to thank you for pronouncing Iredell correctly.
Oh, good.
Mitch, did you have another question?
What is the address of the building if we go over to Hillsborough where this?
I believe it's 201 North Tryon Street. It's as you drive up Churton Street, named after William Churton, the fellow who laid out the town. I think he would find it amusing that there's a car wash named after him. That downtown, there's the Orange County Historical Museum on the corner, the Hillsborough Presbyterian Church right next door, which is kind of a miniature model of this larger church that used to be there. And then there's the cemetery. But 201 North Churton Street is where you can go to the museum. If you go in the museum, you're practically there on the grounds where this convention was taking place. I've loved finding this history. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's taken me all the way to Nantucket and back, chasing down what happened to the church. But maybe that's a story for another day. But it's, oh, well, that's the cool thing. So the church goes up in 1768, and then it becomes this science academy in the 1780s. William Hooper and his good friend James Hogg, or Hogue, he was Scottish, but everybody looked at his name and said, Hogg, well, that's pretty funny. And he didn't think it was that funny. But he's a fellow who's a big force for driving UNC to be located at Chapel Hill. Well, he and Mr. Hooper are good friends. In fact, Mr. Hooper may have played a much more behind-the-scenes background there in Hillsborough during that 1788 convention because he only lived 2 doors down. He just couldn't be elected from New Hanover County because he didn't live there anymore. And in Orange County, there are other people, but he was there, and I have a hunch that he was probably played a much more pivotal role in suggesting to people like Wiley Jones, maybe there's another way we can address this issue. I don't know. But certainly, that's a good reason to visit Hillsborough. You can actually go into that Old Town Cemetery, and in the corner lot, you can actually visit a signer of the Declaration of Independence, William Hooper's grave. So if it's on your bucket list, I want to get to all of them, well, that's a good one to go to as well. But any other questions?
Thank you all very much for coming out. I'm sure Scott would be happy to answer it and talk to you afterwards if you want to stick around. Thank you, Scott, very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.